Every legendary fantasy world begins with familiar tropes audiences secretly adore, despite predictable storytelling patterns. Readers constantly return because epic fantasy tropes create emotional comfort alongside thrilling, imaginative, unforgettable adventures. Chosen one stories immediately attract audiences craving hopeful heroes, overcoming impossible supernatural, terrifying destinies courageously. Fantasy fans love watching ordinary underdogs gradually transform into powerful saviors, protecting vulnerable magical kingdoms. However, audiences quickly lose interest whenever chosen heroes succeed effortlessly without emotional, meaningful, believable struggles. Great fantasy writers humanize destined protagonists through painful sacrifices, insecurities, and difficult personal transformative growth. Readers appreciate chosen heroes, questioning overwhelming responsibilities instead of blindly accepting glorious prophetic expectations immediately. Another beloved fantasy trope introduces mysterious mentors, guiding inexperienced protagonists through dangerous, magical, unfamiliar worlds. Wise mentors create emotional depth while sharing meaningful lessons, influencing heroic decisions throughout adventurous, dangerous journeys. Audiences admire experienced mentors sacrificing personal safety, protecting younger heroes, confronting terrifying, supernatural, destructive enemies. Unfortunately, predictable mentor deaths sometimes frustrate readers expecting fresher emotional storytelling approaches and surprises. Fantasy audiences recognize repetitive mentor sacrifices immediately, reducing emotional impact during supposedly heartbreaking dramatic moments. Strong fantasy stories avoid predictable outcomes by developing mentors beyond traditional mysterious, magical teacher archetypes completely. Readers remain invested whenever mentors possess complicated flaws, regrets, ambitions, and hidden emotional vulnerabilities themselves. Epic fantasy frequently explores ancient prophecies, controlling destinies across magical kingdoms and dangerous surrounding civilizations. Prophecies create suspense because audiences constantly anticipate devastating consequences surrounding misunderstood, ancient supernatural predictions. Readers enjoy interpreting mysterious clues while theorizing surprising twists regarding prophetic warnings and hidden meanings. However, vague prophecies sometimes become frustrating whenever writers prioritize confusion instead of meaningful, emotional storytelling coherence. Great fantasy writers balance mystery carefully while ensuring prophecies strengthen emotional stakes surrounding central heroic characters. Audiences appreciate prophecy storylines, influencing character growth rather than simply predicting unavoidable, predetermined future events. Fantasy readers also adore magical artifacts carrying extraordinary powers, capable transforming worldwide supernatural conflicts dramatically. Legendary swords, enchanted rings, and forbidden relics immediately increase tension throughout dangerous fantasy adventures consistently. Powerful magical artifacts symbolize temptation, corruption, responsibility, and emotional burdens surrounding heroic, difficult choices frequently. Readers love watching heroes resist overwhelming temptations while protecting dangerous artifacts from ruthless, ambitious villains everywhere. Unfortunately, magical artifacts occasionally overshadow emotional storytelling whenever characters depend entirely upon supernatural extraordinary powers. Great fantasy stories ensure magical relics challenge protagonists emotionally instead of solving difficult conflicts effortlessly afterward. Another iconic fantasy trope involves ancient forgotten kingdoms, hiding devastating secrets beneath ruined, mysterious civilizations eternally. Readers become fascinated exploring hidden histories, shaping present conflicts throughout magical, dangerous, imaginative fantasy worlds beautifully. Ancient ruins create wonder because audiences imagine civilizations destroyed through catastrophic, magical, terrifying, supernatural disasters previously. Fantasy fans adore uncovering forgotten truths alongside courageous heroes, exploring dangerous, cursed, abandoned, mysterious landscapes fearlessly. However, excessive world building occasionally overwhelms readers whenever emotional character development receives insufficient, meaningful attention afterward. Great fantasy writers balance fascinating lore carefully while maintaining strong emotional connections surrounding central protagonists consistently. Readers continue watching because emotional investment always matters greater than complicated, historical, magical fantasy details alone. Epic fantasy tropes remain beloved because they reflect universal human fears, hopes, ambitions, and emotional struggles. Audiences emotionally connect whenever fantasy audiences absolutely love morally gray characters hiding dangerous secrets behind charming heroic personalities. Readers become fascinated whenever heroes struggle balancing noble intentions against destructive, emotionally complicated personal desires. Morally conflicted protagonists create tension because audiences constantly question future decisions during dangerous supernatural confrontations. Great fantasy stories reveal hidden darkness gradually, keeping readers emotionally invested throughout unpredictable, adventurous journeys. Audiences admire flawed heroes attempting redemption despite devastating mistakes causing widespread emotional, painful consequences previously. However, morally gray characters become exhausting whenever writers remove meaningful emotional accountability from destructive actions. Readers lose sympathy whenever protagonists repeatedly justify cruelty without experiencing guilt, regret, or transformative emotional growth. Successful fantasy writers balance darkness carefully while maintaining emotional humanity, surrounding conflicted central protagonists consistently. Fantasy audiences also adore massive magical wars, involving kingdoms battling terrifying supernatural enemies across dangerous landscapes. Epic battles create excitement because audiences witness courageous heroes confronting impossible, overwhelming, destructive supernatural forces together. Readers enjoy watching alliances form unexpectedly during desperate circumstances, threatening entire civilizations with catastrophic annihilation constantly. Great fantasy wars reveal emotional sacrifices characters willingly make, protecting vulnerable innocent families and friendships everywhere. Audiences admire brave heroes, risking everything despite overwhelming fear, uncertainty, and devastating emotional, painful losses repeatedly. However, endless battle sequences eventually become repetitive whenever emotional storytelling disappears beneath constant explosive action. Readers remain emotionally invested whenever wars deeply affect character relationships, motivations, and psychological emotional stability afterward. Strong fantasy stories focus equally upon emotional consequences surrounding violence, destruction, and painful, heartbreaking sacrifices consistently. Another beloved fantasy trope introduces mysterious magical schools, training inexperienced heroes, mastering extraordinary, supernatural, dangerous abilities. Readers instantly connect with students exploring magical worlds filled with wonder, competition, and dangerous hidden secrets. Fantasy schools create excitement because audiences imagine themselves learning powerful spells alongside courageous, adventurous protagonists personally. Great magical academies contain rivalries, friendships, betrayals, and emotional challenges, strengthening meaningful character development naturally. Audiences enjoy watching inexperienced heroes gradually discover confidence while overcoming fear, insecurity, and painful personal doubts. However, magical school stories occasionally feel repetitive whenever classrooms overshadow emotional stakes and meaningful narrative progression. Readers lose interest whenever fantasy schools prioritize endless exposition instead of compelling, transformative, emotional storytelling moments. Successful fantasy writers ensure magical education strengthens protagonist growth rather than delaying meaningful, adventurous, dangerous conflicts unnecessarily. Fantasy audiences also love shocking betrayals, dramatically changing story directions during emotionally intense, dangerous supernatural adventures. Betrayals create suspense because readers constantly question character loyalty throughout unpredictable, emotionally charged fantasy conflicts afterward. Audiences become emotionally devastated whenever trusted companions secretly manipulate heroic protagonists for selfish hidden ambitions privately. Great betrayals succeed because emotional relationships receive meaningful development before heartbreaking, shocking revelations suddenly appear later. Readers admire fantasy writers creating believable motivations, explaining why trusted allies unexpectedly abandon important heroic friendships. However, random betrayals frustrate audiences whenever shocking twists lack emotional logic, depth, or believable, meaningful foreshadowing. Fantasy stories become unforgettable whenever betrayals permanently transform courageous protagonists emotionally, psychologically, and morally afterward completely. Readers remain invested whenever betrayed. Heroes confront painful emotional trauma without abandoning compassionate moral principles entirely. Another iconic fantasy trope involves ancient evils awakening after centuries beneath forgotten, cursed, dangerous, mystical kingdoms. Audiences love terrifying ancient villains because overwhelming success. The greatest fantasy tropes survive because audiences emotionally crave wonder, danger, and transformative heroic adventures. Readers continually revisit epic fantasy worlds, searching hopeful escapism alongside meaningful, emotionally relatable human struggles. Fantasy stories become unforgettable whenever familiar tropes reveal deeper truths regarding courage, sacrifice, and emotional resilience. Audiences admire heroes confronting impossible supernatural darkness while protecting innocent lives through compassionate, courageous leadership consistently. Great fantasy writers understand emotional authenticity matters greater than complicated magical systems or detailed world building alone. Readers forgive predictable storytelling whenever characters feel emotionally vulnerable, relatable, and genuinely transformative throughout adventures. Fantasy audiences remain loyal whenever beloved tropes evolve creatively through surprising, emotionally satisfying storytelling directions afterward. One powerful fantasy trope involves unlikely friendships forming between characters from completely opposing, dangerous backgrounds initially. Readers love witnessing emotional bonds gradually develop through hardship, sacrifice, trust, and difficult transformative experiences together. Great fantasy friendships create hope because unity overcomes fear, hatred, prejudice, and devastating emotional, painful divisions. Audiences emotionally connect whenever rival characters eventually protect each other despite previous conflicts and misunderstandings passionately. However, forced friendships occasionally frustrate readers whenever emotional chemistry feels artificial, rushed, or completely unbelievable afterward. Successful fantasy writers develop relationships naturally through meaningful shared experiences, strengthening emotional audience investment continuously. Readers remain engaged whenever friendships influence heroic decisions during dangerous supernatural conflicts and emotional personal struggles. Another beloved fantasy trope introduces hidden royal bloodlines secretly connected with powerful ancient magical destinies mysteriously. Audiences enjoy shocking revelations, transforming ordinary protagonists into important figures, carrying enormous emotional responsibilities suddenly. Hidden lineage stories create excitement because readers anticipate dramatic reactions surrounding unexpected, dangerous royal truths revealed. Great fantasy writers balance surprising revelations carefully while preserving emotional authenticity surrounding courageous central protagonists consistently. Readers admire humble heroes, questioning personal worthiness despite discovering extraordinary royal heritage and supernatural responsibilities afterward. However, hidden royalty becomes predictable whenever protagonists instantly master leadership without emotional, believable, transformative growth realistically. Fantasy audiences appreciate characters struggling emotionally before eventually accepting difficult responsibilities surrounding powerful royal destinies courageously. Another unforgettable fantasy trope features dangerous journeys across cursed lands filled with terrifying supernatural mysterious threats. Readers become fascinated exploring unfamiliar magical territories alongside courageous heroes confronting emotional fears and impossible dangers. Epic journeys symbolize emotional transformation because protagonists gradually overcome weaknesses during physically dangerous adventurous experiences constantly. Great fantasy quests contain emotional obstacles, testing loyalty, courage, morality, compassion, and meaningful personal inner strength. Audiences remain invested whenever difficult journeys permanently transform heroic relationships and emotional psychological perspectives afterward completely. However, endless traveling scenes occasionally become repetitive whenever meaningful emotional development disappears beneath unnecessary world-building details. Successful fantasy stories ensure dangerous quests continuously strengthen emotional stakes surrounding courageous, vulnerable central protagonists consistently. Readers appreciate adventures balancing exciting action sequences alongside meaningful, introspective, emotional character development naturally throughout. Fantasy audiences also adore mysterious magical creatures representing wonder, danger, beauty, and emotional symbolic meaning simultaneously. Dragons, phoenixes, and ancient spirits immediately increase excitement throughout dangerous imaginative fantasy worlds dramatically afterward. Readers become emotionally captivated whenever magical creatures influence heroic growth through wisdom, companionship, or terrifying destructive conflicts. Great fantasy writers create unforgettable creatures possessing emotional symbolism instead of existing purely